Thank you all for coming. My name is John Davis from the Australian Music Centre, and you are attending the Aurora Festival Industry Forum, the first of two, I think, that are taking place over the course of this festival. And we've got a pretty impressive collection of people up here at this table. At the far end, Jim Nightingale, who's President of the New Music Network and the Artistic Director of Continuum Sax. And next to him is Duck-Chong, who's co-artistic director of Halcyon ensemble. Julie Simonds, who wears many hats, and I can never keep up with how many she actually wears, but composer, copyist services.
Mainly special projects.
Special projects. Conservatorium for Music.
Thank you. And also classical consultant for publishing.
And presenting a program on Symphony, amongst other things. Kate Lidbetter, who's CEO of Symphony Services International, the service organisations for the professional orchestras, and the artistic director is your title at Sydney Grammar School, Nicholas Fines. So we're going to be examining opportunities for emerging composers, and to begin with, I'd just like to say a few words. Firstly, I think that emerging is a pretty relative term. And that I think for any artist who's undertaking creative and professional development, that they're essentially emerging throughout their entire career, certainly creatively, if not professionally. And in this particular instance, I guess some of the conversations that we'll have will be focusing very specifically on emerging in the sense of composers who are just starting out to develop creatively and professionally. But also I think there's a broader discussion to be had, and I hope we'll include that in the discussion today about composer opportunities throughout their careers, because I think that's another very, very important thing in the landscape that we need to be very sensitive to and conscious of. I outlined just 2 or 3 questions, areas of discussion that we might cover today, and sent that out to the panel. And firstly, just looking at the landscape, assessing it, and from training through to professional practice, and just seeing the scope of opportunities that actually exist there, who should support composers and why should they support composers, where are the gaps in opportunities, where should there be more opportunities, where do opportunities lie, how does a composer get a gig, competitions, prizes, grants, calls for works, residencies and so on. There's a whole landscape of different things that can happen out there and do happen. Getting performances, scoring the gig, how's that done? How are decisions made by performers and others to, whether it be about commissions or programming, repertoire, those sorts of questions. And then supporting yourself. What can a composer do to actually stimulate their own opportunities? How do they take advantage, best take advantage of the opportunities that are available? I think to start with, just in terms of assessing the landscape, perhaps I'd just like each of the panel to just speak briefly about whether or not there are enough opportunities for emerging composers. Are there too many? And where are the gaps? Jim, can we start at your end of the table?
Well, from the perspective of the Music Network, we run a concert series dedicated to new music, and we run a new music mini-series for younger performers and newly formed groups, some of which, and some of our members and some of those groups featured in the mini-series feature composers as performers. I think that there are a lot of opportunities for young composers to find professional development, but especially artistically, but whether there are opportunities for them to make a living out of being a composer is another question entirely, and I think that's really the tough one, because when composers are emerging from or setting out from being a student at university through to becoming a composer, what does that actually entail? What are their goalposts that they see in front of them that they want to achieve? Do they want to have their recordings played on movies and everywhere around the world so they have huge opera income? Do they want to be writing a new piece, 6 or 7 new pieces every year and receiving a commission for those things? There are different ways of making money out of for a composer, just as there are for performers, and developing your contacts and ways of making that all fit together is, people will be touching on that later, is an entrepreneurial feat in itself, and we all want to see people succeed.
Gee.
Well, I think some of this for me comes back to that whole definition of emerging, because I think one of the things that we looked at, we ran this project last year called First Stones for emerging composers, and that was really about looking at a whole that we saw, which was about writing for voice on a small scale, so a vocal chamber music project. And although there are opportunities in orchestral scales, and there are opportunities in choral scales, and there are certainly ways to have pieces done on a smaller scale. This sort of very small chamber music we thought was a gap that we'd found. And certainly having done a seminar on writing for the voice as well as running this workshop process, we certainly found that there were holes that people wanted to know more about that particular area of writing. So that's one project that we've taken on that we would love to be extending, because we think there's real benefits in that. But on the whole term of emerging, I mean, in the way that we program, and I think we'll cover this later too, emerging is anything that is not being visible. So the sort of composers that we program are not necessarily, they're new to our audiences just as much as they're new in their take.
Yes, well, the orchestral world is a slightly different beast than the small to medium sector, and each of the 6 symphony orchestras is very interested in emerging composers and who's out there and where they're coming through. Each of the orchestras has their own individual programs, and obviously, we'll talk a little bit later about programming and how one gets selected to be performed by the symphony orchestras. But what we have recognised is that it's difficult for a composer to get the skills that they need to write for a full symphony orchestra, because often they don't get those sorts of opportunities. And so Symphony Services International has looked at filling that gap. We invest in a number of training opportunities for emerging composers, and these have sort of changed and evolved a little bit over the years. At the moment, the main one that we're involved with is co-hosted by the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra, and I can talk a little more about that later if that's useful for people. But I think Julie's right, it's about getting the information out to people. I think that composers that have an interest in writing for orchestra need to forge relationships, and with the orchestras themselves, also with Symphony Services International. And the orchestras are really looking at programming and at encouraging the gamut of composers from emerging just out of universities, right through obviously to senior composers that they want to support as well.
Before we go to Nick, Kate, you mentioned something there about developing the skills to be able to take advantage of the opportunity to begin with.
Yeah.
And that's been an ongoing issue, hasn't it, when it comes to symphonic opportunities for composers in the symphonic sector?
Yeah.
Do you see ways of resolving that somehow, or...?
I think the composers that really have an aspiration to write for orchestra will find a way to get those skills. I mean, a lot of the programs and opportunities that the orchestras are providing, we're not really looking for really unemerged. There is a level of skill and professionalism that the composer needs to have really before they would come to our programs. I mean, Symphony Australia's Artist Development Program, which also encompasses opportunities for conductors and performers, is about bridging the gap. So it's not generally aimed at people involved in a tertiary course or even younger still than that. It's really looking at people who have decided that this is going to be their career, have got those basic skills, and then we're looking at how we can get them up to the level that they would be considered professional. So yeah, they do have to already have some ability, and that's hard in a university. It's impossible, I think, in a school situation, but even in a tertiary institution, you don't get those opportunities. I don't think as much as you would get the opportunity to write for a small ensemble and then have your work performed, which of course is what you need to be able to hear what you've written and to be able to learn and to grow. So we do recognise that it's a problem, and Interestingly, it's not just symphony services that is recognising that the orchestras themselves, I'm looking at my little list of notes that I've got here, and several of the orchestras are running training opportunities or composition opportunities for quite young composers. They're not just looking for people who've got a body of work.
And certainly that landscape has changed a lot. I think there was a National Orchestral Composers School partnership that ANC did with then ABC Concert Music, which started in 1979 and ran for a significant period of time. And that was the only opportunity, I think, that young composers had to write for orchestras. In that first program, Helene Katz-Chernin, Graham Kerner, Carl Vine, David Worrell, Simon Wade, I think was the lineup, 5 young composers.
It's got the most impressive
And,
history,
and,
hasn't it?
but interesting to see now that landscape where you have not only Tasmania, Melbourne, Sydney, West Australia, they're all running some kind of program for young composers, and certainly increasingly in the community orchestra sector too. Many of them, well, Kurungai to begin with, but there are many of them who are also running similar programs. So that landscape has developed significantly over time, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, the TSO program that we run in collaboration with TSO is the sort of direct descendant of NOS and then ACOP. And, you know, some of the names that have come through those programs are now tutoring and mentoring in that program, which is fabulous to see. But around that, so there was always this kind of national opportunity, which I would say the TSO program now represents. But around that, the orchestras have realised that, you know, they need to encourage and help develop composers, particularly in their own state, but not just. It's a little broader than that, but they all do have, you know, an interest in young composers coming through their tertiary institutions.
Thanks. Nick?
I thought, as the closest thing to an emerging composer on the panel, I would speak from that perspective. I've been in the US for 10 years, so things have changed markedly since I was an undergraduate, when there were extremely few opportunities. There are certainly, I wouldn't say an abundance of opportunities now, but there are more, or they're at least more visible, which is great. The issue, though, that I'd like to focus on first is more that those opportunities are wonderful for a young composer to explore what they want to say musically, what they want to do to learn the skills, perhaps, if not for orchestra, for chamber forces, essentially to fulfill the role that's set out historically as the function of an art music composer, as expressing individuality and the values of, well, I'm not going to put values in people's mouths, but certainly the idea of expressing some kind of individual voice. And so you get those opportunities, and even I got some of those opportunities when I was a young composer, or younger, I should say. A slightly less emerging composer. And they were fantastic because I could do what I wanted. But at a certain point you hit the brick wall when suddenly you're not counted as a young composer. And I certainly had instances where I would go into a competition and I would not, or competition's not sure the right word, but I'd apply for a certain program and not get in because I was considered too developed and I just didn't get that opportunity. Then what do you do? Where are those opportunities once you get past that point? The opportunities past that point tend to be, for want of a better term, in the marketplace. So suddenly you have a whole set of different expectations placed upon you as a composer, that you have to write something that's sellable to an audience that is not a university audience, is not you and your friends, but a broader audience that enable a big musical institution or ensemble to continue to promote new music. If they present something that you decided you wanted to do, there are too many complaints to justify that happening again. So the choices made have to be in line with with keeping audiences happy. So there's a disjunct from the opportunities at a very young age and really emerging to somewhat less emerging, more establishing themselves type composers. And I think that's something that's very important to address, not least in the context of writing for orchestra, because I would say actually that having spent most of my adult life in universities until now when I'm teaching in a secondary school, that secondary schools are actually, at least, let's be blunt, affluent secondary schools that have access to orchestral instruments and forces and the demographic that's interested in orchestral music. Those sort of forums allow for young kids to learn about the orchestra by osmosis. They're playing in them, they listen. I know at the school that I teach at that the orchestra plays at assembly very often. It's something that is kind of part of the culture. But at a tertiary level, it's certainly, just the other week, Sydney University Symphony Orchestra did Mahler 1. So it's certainly part of a university culture, but it's not something that everyone would come into contact with, and not even all the music students would come into contact with. And certainly they're going to play big canonic works like Mahler's First Symphony, not young composers. Certainly since that many of departments have either been closed or downsized. So but it's less about which one is better than the other and more about that there isn't a continuous line of education. There's no, if you pardon the pretension, there's no pedagogical continuity. There's no way of building from a young trying to emerge to somewhat emerge to definitely emerge to established. That line has disappeared, largely to do with the change in government funding over the last how many decades, but also to do with the change of culture and to do with different expectations placed on educational institutions, which are also often related to money, particularly in the case of universities. So that's a lot of talk that's not very musical, but that's certainly the beginnings of my thoughts on yes, there are a lot of opportunities, but they're not related, or there are enough opportunities, but they're not related to each other. There's no sense of building a career other than the individual making certain choices, and often you can't choose to win a competition, you can't choose to be part of the program. That's outside of your path.
Yes, I agree. There are a number of things you mentioned there that interest me greatly. One in particular is the issue about it's a horses for courses issue. That, a composer wanting to write whatever they want to write rather than for a particular context, or bend what they want to write to suit a particular opportunity, I guess. The issue of training and that pedagogical continuity is a massive question, and it is something that I think is very difficult to try and find solutions to, given the state of the education system from secondary, particularly tertiary level. I think that's often where the gaps are, and certainly from tertiary into professional practice. And I think that's some of the challenges from the orchestra's point of view. Yeah. That gap. And I think it's even more critical these days too in the orchestral sector, because an orchestra costs so much bloody money, and the time it actually takes to guide participants in such programs through that program without wasting time fixing minor things, craft-based things that haven't been attended to initially, is a real challenge. The issue for the horses for courses thing in terms of ensembles is particularly interesting, because we have a plethora of new music ensembles of all shapes and sizes in this country, and certainly it's probably a richer and more fertile landscape than we've ever seen before, all around the country. And I think for composers that provides particular kinds of challenges about who should I be pitching things to, and what kinds of things should I be pitching to particular people. Can we just start exploring that question a little bit more, perhaps starting again down the end of the table, because Jim and Jenny in particular are faced with those questions of what kinds of works are you looking for, what determines the decisions that you make about not just programming, but also about the development opportunities too, Jenny, from your perspective. But Jim, would you like to start on that first?
Sure. From the perspective of Continuum Sax, we have had good and bad experiences commissioning young composers or emerging composers or composers full stop. Ideally, we come through when we get a new piece from a composer, whether we've commissioned it or not, or rather paid for a commission or not. We want to have a piece which we can play. We want a piece that can be recorded and then of interest to our audience. And we want something for the composer that is then transferable to other groups, so that work can go and have a life in other places if it's worthy of that point. And some pieces we've had written for us certainly have ticked some of those boxes, and other ones have been played once by us and never again to be seen or heard on the face of the earth, which is sad in a way, but I think that the difference between those things is those sort of experiences. It's not necessarily the talent or vision or having, or of us having imposed an artistic standard upon the work, but upon the ability of the composer to negotiate with us and be self-critical and take the time to go back and revise and decide what works from their perspective as well. So I think that's when you get a new work for a draft, there are two important things to be talked about. One is do the performers find it easy to play, and then does what the performers are doing relate to what the composer expects to be hearing, and then being able to work through those issues to come up with something which is really great is important. And I think that not only happens in things like Jenny will probably talk about the first Stones, the Halcyon project from last year, which was fantastic. But I think it also happens with all composers, and learning to have that sort of the humility to change your ideas and find a way of successfully expressing the idea that the musicians really get is important. It doesn't necessarily happen with the first piece as well. So multiple opportunities is really important, and I think that's what one of the things that Nicholas was getting at before, perhaps with the orchestral scene, is that you get these opportunities as a very young composer to play with it, to have your piece performed in an educational or professional development context, but the next piece, which may well be better, doesn't necessarily find a home in any part of the orchestral sector, and it's a very, very difficult and vexed question. And of course there are the exceptions that I'm sure that can be cited against that sort of impression or feeling of a few other composers that I know.
So many things. I think going back to the whole commissioning thing, much as you, there are what you call a commission because we paid for it, what we call a commission because it was given to us. There are all sorts of pieces that come to us. And again, it's about a piece, what you want is a piece that not only lives in your repertoire, but that will go on to have other lives. And one of our basic premises is that a piece of music becomes great not because it has a first performance or even a second performance, but because it can have multiple performances, and that multiple performers can bring something new to it, so that the first performance and the first performer isn't the only life it has. That's a little soapbox, so I won't go there. But the notion that the other side of that is the relationships that come out of those things. So there is the process of that commissioning, and if you ask me someone's asked me that before, the best way to work with a composer on a piece, and every single example I'd cite would be different, because every relationship with every composer and performer is in of itself its own beast. So I don't think there is a one model, and I think that's one of the reasons that as composers you need to gravitate towards people whose performance you enjoy, or other composers whose music you enjoy. And I think in the context of First Stones, one of the things that was really important to us was not only were they dealing with us as performers, but there was a composer mentor, and there were fellow composers and I think a number of those composers would say they learned more out of listening to other people's pieces and the approach to those things than they actually got out of hearing. I mean, they got things out of their own piece, but it was the way that other people explored similar ideas and similar things that they got as much experience from. And on top of that, the other thing that I would add is that it's not that first relationship or that first commission, it's what comes from that. I mean, I can think of numerous composers who I knew as emerging, on the newest of the youngest end of that perspective, that I've now known for a decade or 15 years old. Watched their work progress, they've sent us things, we've had conversations, we catch up, we sometimes reprogram work, sometimes we don't, but we're in communication, and we'll put other people in touch with them and say, you should hear about so-and-so, you should do this. And it's the dialogue, it is the community that we build, the relationships, absolutely right.
Kate, the horses for courses issue and orchestras, both in terms of programming, I guess, but also in terms of how composers might be pitching to orchestras and the kinds of music that might be considered.
That's really difficult. I mean, all kinds of music will be considered, and it's really important that composers have, first of all, feel that they can approach the orchestras, because you can. And secondly, that you've got the right kind of materials. So it was interesting what Jules was saying about, dropping things in on Continuum. Yes, that obviously requires you to have a really good quality recording of your work. And the orchestras kind of need that too, or it certainly helps if you can submit good quality recording and the score. Having an advocate, preferably a well-known and respected advocate, really, really makes probably more difference than anything else. And obviously the way that you approach the orchestras and the respect with which you do that and the understanding of the orchestral business with which you do that is really important too. So, I guess not having an expectation necessarily that it will come to anything, because there's no entitlements, but politely persisting, because first of all, tastes change, the decision makers change quite regularly. The interesting thing about orchestras is that all of them have international artistic directors. They don't have Australians at the helm, and they don't have people who are year-round at the helm. So, the taste of those international chief conductors makes an enormous amount of difference. And some of them are incredibly supportive of Australian music and Australian composers, and quite knowledgeable about them as well. But I guess it's true to say that some of them aren't, and particularly newer ones, of course, you need some time to get up to speed. We were talking a little at the other end of the table about commissioning versus repeat performances. And again, I suppose a difference in the orchestral sphere is that as an emerging composer, it's difficult to get commission, but it's probably equally difficult, if not possibly more difficult, to get an existing work performed. If you have been through one of the training or development programs that are hosted by an individual orchestra, you are much more likely to have a relationship with the decision makers in that organisation. You're more likely to know what players are like, what the musicians themselves are like. You're more likely to have a relationship that you can fall back on that will help you to get a foot in the door. It's not impossible, obviously, but it is less likely for an emerging composer to get an opportunity with one of the symphony orchestras than it is perhaps for someone a little more established further down the line, whose music has been heard by the artistic administrators and the chief conductors and so on. In terms of repeat performances, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with composers where the composer has said to me that, in fact, much as it's lovely to have a work performed again, they don't make much money out of that. The money's in the commissioning. And I know that that's actually understood by the orchestras. All of them have a fairly healthy attitude toward commissioning and regularly do commission. Where repeat performances can come into play is with co-commissions, and that's something that Symphony Services International is working much more towards these days. We've got a smaller commissioning budget than we had previously, where we used to get dedicated Australia Council funding towards commissioning. We no longer get that grant, which was quite significant, and the orchestras themselves are not specifically funded to commission new works, although obviously the funding bodies expect and require that of them, but they don't actually provide any money towards it. So the money that we do allocate to commissioning from our artist development budget, we try and almost always succeed to make that a co-commission so that it will be performed not just by one orchestra but hopefully by many.
Well, co-commissioning is really, really important. And this is from the publishing side of it. And that I have an easier time selling a performance of Graham Kerner in the States than I do of getting a Graham Kerner performed in Australia for a repeat performance of the work, because we've done Powerhouse. We're not doing it again, but I've got definitely in the States this next week. And when it comes to the co-commissions, there's a lot of European orchestras that are very, very interested in doing a co-commission, but they normally don't. They normally come through the publishing company with a, and the company is Music Sales, which is G. Schirmer and Chester Novello. And so they come through that way and organise a co-commission, because they have said to me, we've got Tam Dun, and you wouldn't believe the price that he gets for his commission. I mean, I've been in for a couple of years on it. And they say, we've got Tam Dun, can we get a co-commission in Australia with it? And the price is too high, but I go back to them and say, can we get a co-commission with whoever the composer is that I'm trying to get a co-commission of? And right now there's a co-commission of a saxophone concerto with the Netherlands Orchestra and Elena Katz-Channon on a saxophone concerto. Now that will work. She will get a performance here, and she will get a performance over there.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to share the costs and indeed get the multiple performances in different contexts by different performers again.
I think the composers themselves are more interested in getting a second performance.
Yes, and also I think that composers should be also be thinking about how they might be constructing such a scenario to be proposing, to pitch. I have these other people interested in me, and you're also potentially interested. How would you like to?
It's much easier to get funding that way.
Yeah. But that shouldn't only be initiated by the institutional side of it. I think it's also possible for the artist to actually be constructing those ideas as well. Nick, I meant to come back to you earlier because you're the one that raised the issue about horses for courses. As a composer, have you had the situation where you completely picked the wrong jockey or picked the wrong horse?
Well, I think some organisations that have commissioned me have perhaps thought they've picked the wrong jockey. I've had some, and actually this goes back to sort of, I think Julie, you brought it up, institutional attitudes and the importance of institutional attitudes. One organisation, which I won't name, obviously, commissioned me. It was a very large work for orchestra and chorus, and the attitude throughout the whole process was extremely disrespectful. I think extremely disrespectful regardless of the aesthetic, though that was a big part of it. But generally the attitude, not ironically from the people involved who were amateurs and who were just doing it out of love, they really enjoyed the process. But the professional, who were the majority, the professional attitude towards it was extremely hostile. And there was no attempt to push it as something worthwhile, as something that actually this is of value. It was more like, well, this is a process we have to go through. And that message, to some degree, comes across to the audience. And to put a more positive spin on it, there are people out there. I've had a very good relationship, for instance, with Richard Gill, who is wonderful at saying, hey kids, well, in the case, I had one piece done by MLC School. This is 10 years ago. It was also for orchestra and chorus. And it was not particularly out there aesthetically, but in the context of schools, it was a bit odd. It was, used things that kids wouldn't usually come across in an HSC, in a Board of Studies syllabus. And the kids doing it, they really disliked it. They really hated doing it because it was something they weren't used to. It was something that was not technically beyond them, but sort of technically pushed them, meant that they had to practice, which was not something that they usually did outside of rehearsals. And so there was initially a lot of antagonism towards it. And Richard came up and said, well, actually, this is really good in these ways, and showed them very specifically why this particular piece was worthwhile. And I'm pretty sure he did this for other pieces too, but for whatever reason, particularly my piece, because of the difficulty of it. And by the end of the whole process, they genuinely really enjoyed it, because they were shown a way of accessing it and a way of enjoying it by someone in a position of authority, which goes back to, I think, what you were saying about the importance of people who are in positions of authority, sponsoring, advocating.
And Richard, is a perfect example of exactly that.
Exactly, and certainly one of the best in the Australian context. And so
education, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's got to educate the people on how to get them to get the young people enthused.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. We've still got to educate the older folk, because I even got the other night that people weren't turning up to Heinsohn's flute concerto because they don't like new music. There you go, you don't even know. They're bundling everything of new music into one thing. They said, no, we'll get there for the drinks afterwards.
and the fundamental premise of this new educational model should be letting people know that music doesn't have to have one function. Music doesn't have to be a sedative. Music doesn't have to be something that's only enjoyable. Music doesn't have to be something that makes you feel like being sick the entire time. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. It can. It can be extremely challenging. It could be, like sucking on a lollipop for half an hour. And either of those options could exist in the same piece. And so you don't necessarily have to have one demographic going to lollipop and the other demographic going to, rhubarb, uncooked rhubarb. I don't know. It's about saying, hey, if you come to this without expecting to have this kind of reaction, maybe you'll get some other value out of it.
There are lots of ways for composers to develop themselves, if not through formal structures and things being provided, opportunities being provided. But I really want to stress that thing of learning how to navigate through the landscape, seeing what opportunities arise, are there, and how one might create their own opportunities and fully exploit them effectively. And there are lots of opportunities to do that. Thank you all to the panellists, Jim Nightingale, Jenny Duck-Chong, Julie Simonds. Sorry, I just had a mental block there for a moment. It's not you, Julie, it's me. Kate Lidbetter and Nick Vines. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you for listening.